howl of a wolf is a sound that chills the very marrow of our bones. Even today, it still raises the most primitive fears. A howling wolf is one that invites its own death sentence. In Western Europe, most countries have relentlessly hunted down all their wolves. But in northern Spain, the wolf has slipped through the noose of extinction. Here, in the mountains, often within sight of the tiny villages, the wolves continue to hold out. Unpredictable, elusive, and immensely strong, they have become the object of fierce controversy. Northern Spain is a far cry from the Sunshine Coasts. Storms from the Atlantic bring snow to its rugged limestone mountains. It's a wilderness where European vultures still fly, ever watchful for a carcass or the remains of a kill. You might expect wolves in these lonely mountains, but they also live within sight of Spain's northern beaches. This is the resort of Vigo, in Galicia. Up in the hills above the sunbathers, the wolf may be watching. In villages further inland, there is fear and hatred of wolves. In the 1970s, a child was attacked in this village near Orense. But the major source of anger today is that sheep, cattle, and goats are being killed. Farmers are convinced it's the work of wolves, although without doubt many of the attacks are made by domestic dogs run wild. But it's the wolf that gets the blame. Now it is in the thick of a row about compensation for the damage.
Hemos hecho unas solicitudes, nadie nos ha contestado nada. ¿Qué vamos a decir nosotros de la administración?
Here, 2 shepherds lost more than 50 sheep, and 30 more were injured, near Toro, north of Salamanca. In Europe, hatred of the wolf goes back to the times when wolves murdered flocks of sheep and made men poor every night. Archive scenes from Yugoslavia show that even in quite recent days, dogs were trained to fight wolves to the death. Hunters made a living trapping and poisoning wolves. The corpses were paraded through the village. Every family was obliged to give food and wine in return for being rid of the killers. From the beginning, the wolf has engaged our imagination as no other animal. To this day, it still lurks in the back of European minds as a dark, distant terror. But in Spain today, that fear remains a reality. It's a country which still has wild and unspoilt places, echoes of an older Europe, where mules and donkeys are used as draft animals, where herdsmen still accompany their stock in all weathers. One of Spain's wolf specialists lives in the region of Galicia in the northwest. Felipe Bárcena is a biologist at the nearby University of Santiago. He's also the Count of Torrecedera. Over the past 20 years, Barthena has collected the bodies of several hundred wolves killed in this region. Spanish or Iberian wolves are a separate race, with characteristic dark markings on the front legs. Like all true wolves, they're very different from dogs. In fact, Barthena believes that wolves kill stray dogs if they outnumber them. A wolf has stronger teeth and more powerful jaws. In Spain, a well-grown male wolf can be about as long as a person is tall, up to 6 feet from nose to tail. This one was shot after attacking a small horse. Wolves have fascinated Barthena since childhood, but even he has only ever caught the most fleeting glimpses of them in the wild. Hounded by man, the last wolves have learned to move like shadows. Biologists have precious little to go on when investigating the Spanish wolf. Guillermo Palomero of Cantabria University has to rely on one of the few things that even wolves cannot always hide.
I think these are wolf tracks. It's very difficult to distinguish wolf tracks from dogs. Many studies have been made on the tracks of wolves and dogs, and no significant differences have been found. But from my experience, these tracks here are wolves.
A wolf track is large, up to 4 inches across, and it's one of the very few clues that this evasive animal gives of its whereabouts. The Cantabrian mountains in late winter. The carcass of a donkey lies out in the snow, attended by a golden eagle. Ravens mob the eagle while they wait their turn. Ravens often follow eagles, and sometimes wolves, in the hope of eventually getting something to eat. A hill fox is trying to feed, but the eagle is the more powerful of the two. A scrap of meat away from the carcass has attracted the fox's attention, and it tries to run in for it. Foxes are sometimes killed by eagles if they're caught unawares. But now the eagle is suddenly nervous. The chamois above have been alarmed too. The owners are returning for the carcass. They are very cautious out in the open, even though they left the kill only a few hours ago. They've had to be wary to survive. Generally, wolves are shot on sight in Spain. To film 3 wolves together is remarkable. This is probably a pair with one of last year's youngsters. Except in a few places, big packs find it hard to exist because of lack of large prey. Poisoning and hunting may have taken their toll of pack numbers too. Wolves were once the most widely distributed mammal in Europe. Now they're against the wall. The slightest noise may be the prelude to a rifle shot, and they're constantly alert for any sound or the slightest whiff of danger. The eagle has returned, but it's come too close. If it's not careful, the wolves will make it clear who's in charge. One of them makes a run at the eagle. The eagle takes flight. It's the wolves that rule this mountain kingdom. Eventually, having gorged themselves, the wolves make off. They're generally territorial animals. They mark their ground in two ways, by howling and by scent marking. As a wolf moves, its nose is constantly at work. The ground is dotted with clues. Scent is probably a wolf's greatest source of information. Another wolf, a fox, a dog, a human, or perhaps even a meal under the snow. But little has been known until recently about the rare Spanish wolf's furtive way of life. Biologists have now begun detailed research. Vicente Urios and his team hardly ever catch sight of the wolves in their study area. So some months ago, they trapped several and put radio collars on them to follow their daily movements with the receiver. Each wolf sends out a different radio signal, and every day the team plot where individuals have gone. After months of work, they've discovered that many wolves have become loners, traveling extensively, maybe ranging up to 20 miles a night, often without pausing. But perhaps the most surprising thing is that wolves can exist undetected, cheek by jowl, with man. This female even brought up a litter of cubs just a few hundred yards from a village. This wolf doesn't yet have a collar. It has evaded every attempt the scientists have made to catch it. In the early mornings, before man is about, a wolf may go hunting in the fields near the village. It'll grab a mouse if it can't find anything larger. Nothing is too small for an opportunist. Roe deer are a wolf's natural prey, but all too often they're difficult to come by because man likes to hunt them too. A hare is snapped up and quickly dispatched. Anything left over is buried. The wolf will almost certainly remember where it has hidden it, and on a dark and hungry winter's day, come and dig it up again. One occasion when solitary wolves seek the company of others is at mating time. Why wolves howl has always been a mystery. It may be to assemble the pack before hunting, or as an expression of solidarity against rival groups. The eerie song of the wolf carries far and wide, over 30 square miles, because the howls are slightly out of tune with each other. But in modern Spain, the isolated groups seldom get an answer. Howling also bonds the pack members together, but their main form of communication is by the expressions on their faces, which are made all the more plain by the dark markings around the ears, eyes, and muzzle. Wolves are always signaling and interacting, and no more intensely than during the mating season. The males fight for the pack leadership. They show submission by holding their tails between their legs and their bodies low to the ground. As they fight for position, an aggressive male will raise his tail to display his dominance. The huge fangs are bared within inches of each other's throats and vital organs. The subordinate animal, on the left, shows his teeth in a fearful grin of appeasement. Both males and females establish their own hierarchies. To human eyes, these are terrifying expressions. Wolves may not take them quite so seriously. However, their rough and tumble does have an earnest purpose: to establish who's in charge. In the end, wolves depend on cooperation, not strife. Fighting seldom erupts into violence because there are ritualized moves to inhibit bloodshed. If an animal submits, he or she is unlikely to be badly attacked. Eventually, one individual pushes their way to the top, and a semi-amicable truce sets in. And when the dominant male senses that the dominant female is receptive, he moves in to father the next generation. Wolves tie together for up to half an hour, and the two can only snarl at anyone who gets too close for their comfort. In 9 weeks, the cubs will be born. But first, a safe place to have them must be found, away from the prying eyes of humans. In Spain, shepherds are always on the move, searching for new grass. The herds go where the shepherds can rent grazing, often traveling 1,000 miles in a season. In summer, they take the flocks up into the mountains to avoid the parching heat, and they're driving them into one of the last wolf territories. Lambs are born along the way and must not straggle behind. Though shepherds catch glimpses of them during the day, It's at night that the wolves are most active. It is usually when sheep are unguarded that wolves are tempted to kill them. It doesn't happen frequently, despite what shepherds would have you believe. On average, each wolf in Spain accounts for only a couple of sheep a year. Wolves prefer wild prey. A wild boar has fallen to the pack. They feed fast, squabbling only when they get to the last few bones. Wild animals are the major part of a wolf's diet, but it still pays a heavy price for the occasional misdemeanor. The northern mountains of Spain once had a thriving population of wolves, which constantly preyed on domestic stock. Before guns were widely available, most villages built traps to kill the raiding wolves. In the Picos de Europa district, beaters drove them towards stockades that ended in stone pitfalls. The animals were pushed along the valley towards the V-shaped trap. In 1946, when this forest ranger was 13, he took part in the last wolf hunt here, stationed in one of the pointed wooden hides. The wolves found themselves caught between the fences and funneled past the hides. Then they were driven over the 15-foot drop into the stone trap. The ranger recalls the final hunt. The image of a wolf as a raider is still very much alive in people's minds in rural Spain. As this rare film shows, even in the 1960s, it was not unknown for a wolf to attack a flock of sheep in broad daylight. In all likelihood, this was a young, inexperienced wolf, or a she-wolf, desperate to feed her cubs. The shepherd didn't have an effective sheepdog, and he wasn't armed. Eventually, the wolf made off. But it's exceptional incidents like these that have become embedded in people's memories, and the fear remains. Also, in living memory, there have been reports of attacks on children in Spain. The reports emanate from wild Galicia in the northwest, and very few have been substantiated. In this region, the wolves exist largely on rubbish and waste from chicken farms. In one case, in 1975, a wolf seized a child playing alone in a garden outside the village of Amiodoso. An old man who was nearby and the victim recall the incident.
It dragged him to that wall over there. The child was screaming, and when his grandfather realized, he yelled at the wolf with his fists like this.
The boy's grandfather nearby managed to throw a hand scythe at the wolf as it dragged the boy along the field, and it finally dropped him. The victim, Luis Fernandez, was 3 years old at the time. Now 18, he recalls what happened.
I was told to stay here on the path, but I went down into the garden. I could see a wolf coming along. He jumped over the wall as I was sitting there playing. That's when he grabbed me by the leg. And as you can see, I still have the scars today.
Photographs taken at the time show he had a narrow escape. It took him a month to recover. Subsequently, 5 wolves were shot or poisoned, one of them a female with cubs near to starvation. But to put the reports in perspective, there have been only 2 deaths definitely caused by wolves this century in Spain, both unattended children. And while this is far less than the several hundred deaths attributed to attacks by dogs in Spain in the same period, it's the dark, primal fear of wolves that still captures the headlines. Without a doubt, a wolf is so strong, it could quite easily kill an unarmed adult if it wanted to. But the fact is, wolves don't. It is they who are fearful of people. In a rocky cave, a she-wolf has a litter of cubs. They're just 3 days old. The Spanish wolf is an adaptable animal, and a mother may have her cubs in a variety of places, in a ditch, in a patch of heather, or simply in a stand of long grass. But wherever the cubs are born, they must be well hidden. They're blind and deaf, and only strong enough to crawl the few inches it takes to find milk. They're about 1 pound in weight and drink half a pint of milk a day each. The she-wolf is exhausted after giving birth, and for long periods, the family will simply sleep. She won't leave her tiny cubs for the first few days, but eventually thirst drives her out to find water. It's a dangerous time. If a suckling mother is spotted leaving a denning area in the late spring, then the chances are that the local shepherd will get to hear about it. After generations of struggle against the wolf, no shepherd has the slightest hesitation in destroying a litter in areas where he's allowed to do so. Even if the mother returns now, she won't attack. Her fear of humans is stronger even than her instinct to save her family. In the past, some cubs were beaten to death in their dens. Others were taken and shown round the village and money was collected. Most eventually starved to death. Today, the authorities require that cubs should be put down humanely, but this isn't always the case. Taking the lives of cubs without a license has been illegal for the last 20 years. But many country people still detest the wolf enough to destroy it before it has a chance to destroy anything of theirs. Killing adult wolves also needs a permit. They are a protected game species. But in the more remote corners of the mountains, indiscriminate persecution still continues. On a trail regularly used by wolves, an illegal steel-jawed trap is set. These brutal traps are indiscriminate and catch anything that passes, including the seldom seen Spanish bear. This mother probably gnawed her foot off to escape from a trap or a snare. The amazing thing is that she has managed to raise 2 cubs. Bears once ranged all over northern Spain. Now there are just 80 left in the Cantabrian mountains. While this film was being made, a female was killed by a poacher who offered her skin for sale. The police got to hear about it and raided his house to find these bear cubs. They're being looked after by a nature protection society, but their future is bleak. There's little chance of returning them to the wild because they will lack the basic survival skills that they should have gained from their mother. Brown bears are on the point of dying out forever in Spain. They're being killed for raiding beehives and taking foals. Also, when fully grown, they're fearsome and powerful animals, and man finds the threat of their presence difficult to accommodate. Something which is equally true of the Iberian wolf. One day, it could face the same fate. Just a few individuals locked up in a zoo. Like bears, wolves were poisoned in huge numbers in the 1950s and 60s in Spain. Until recently, the number of survivors wasn't known. But a new survey has now been carried out by a team led by biologist Juan Carlos Blanco. In 1987 and 1988, the team visited more than 1,000 of Spain's most remote villages. Juan Carlos's first stop for information was usually the bar. This particular day was a fiesta, and they were rounding up the sheep to pen them in for the day. At the bar, there are plenty of stories about wolves that howl in the surrounding hills. The first thing is to get reliable eyewitness accounts. This farmer came face to face with 5 wolves when he was out looking for some cows he'd lost. They stared at him for a while and then made off into the woods. Later, Juan Carlos will cross-check his sighting against reports from nearby villages. That way he can begin to cut down the amount of exaggeration which inevitably creeps in. The best time of year for accurate information is when the young wolf cubs are beginning to move around but haven't yet learned to keep out of sight. The farmer also saw cubs in a wood just above the village. Wherever a wolf family was reported, Juan Carlos would then try to investigate it for himself. He came across plenty of tales, but above all, great resentment that compensation was not paid for the damage that wolves do. But a dramatic picture was beginning to emerge, that the Spanish wolf is re-establishing itself in areas from which it was once banished. Wolves are on the increase, and their reappearance is causing dismay among shepherds who want to exterminate these new settlers.
I don't want to see a single one. I would swear it to General Franco himself if he were to rise from the dead. All those wretched wolves that roam around, I don't want them. Last year, when I saw them at Fuente del Obispo, I was so frightened, my heart rose up in my throat.
In the wheat fields of the central meseta of northern Spain, there are far fewer livestock, and most are better protected. There is not much cover, and there are no large game animals. This is hardly a place you'd think of looking for wolves. A rare glimpse of a new colony of Spanish wolves, which have returned to a region they once occupied. There's a litter of month-old cubs. Now in July, the parents are in their sleeker summer coats. They're moving the cubs to a new den area, something they do every 2 or 3 weeks, so that they are less likely to be found. It's the first long journey for the cubs. the field must seem like a prairie, and they're hungry. But the adults try to keep them moving. They're vulnerable out in the open. Altogether, there are 10 cubs in the litter. This is something that has only once been recorded before in Spain. Equally extraordinary is the fact that this litter was born a few miles from a major city. As there are few roe deer and wild boar here, and domestic stock is too well protected, the wolves have to be flexible in their hunting. As much as half their diet may be smaller animals, like hares and rabbits. Food is brought back in their mother's stomach and regurgitated. When a cub wants food, it jumps up and licks its mother's muzzle. It's trying to find out what she's eaten and whether there's any left. Later, as adults, the cub will use this gesture to show submission. The youngsters also check out the pack males, who eventually tire of them if they haven't any food to give. The female is protective and makes sure that the other adults don't take the cub's food. Here she wards off the male. The cubs establish who's dominant and who's submissive. However, in the process, they form strong emotional bonds with each other and the adults. This is the side of the wolf we begin to identify with. Powerful emotional attachments, lasting family ties, complex patterns of communication, and strength tempered by friendship. But the subtleties of a wolf's family life have not been so widely appreciated in the Spanish countryside. By 1970, the all-out war waged against wolves had reduced their numbers to a few hundred. But then a new law banned the use of poisons, and the wolf began to recover. There are now between 1,500 and 2,000 wolves in Spain, the best population in Western Europe. But the war is by no means over. This family was later wiped out by poachers. Today's wolves turn up in unexpected places. The urban fox is well established here, but a wolf scavenging the rubbish dumps in Spanish towns is a new phenomenon. Wolves sometimes come down from the hills to nose around for scraps. In areas where the wolf has reappeared, there are bound to be problems. How will stockmen protect their animals? In the Cantabrian mountains, game wardens like Emilio Roy are encouraging the use of a special breed of sheepdog.
This is one of the mastins that has been bred in the farm we have. This is a typical Spanish race of dog used by shepherds to protect the cattle from wolves. So we give them to the shepherds. They are free, and mainly in territories where wolf is a problem. And, well, they have very good success.
The Spanish Mastin is an ancient breed of wolf dog about twice the size of an Alsatian, and it can easily push over a full-grown person and pin them to the ground. With a spiked collar to guard its throat, it's quite able to keep wolves at bay. In some places, shepherds have always kept Mastins. They also keep away stray dogs and poachers. But in other regions, stockmen cannot be bothered to keep these large, boisterous and hungry sheepdogs, so their flocks graze unguarded. And this invites trouble, particularly where there are young wolves. By the end of the winter, the cubs of the year are well grown. They may have split up from their parents, or it may simply be that their parents have been killed. In quieter, more isolated regions, the young playfully explore their surroundings. A toad has come down to the lakeshore. It has a defense against predators, but the young wolves have to learn this. The toad has warts on its body that exude foul, toxic chemicals. One of the young wolves has got a nasty mouthful of toad poison. The others weren't so inquisitive. It'll recover, given time, but the lesson not to mess around with toads is learnt. Groups of predators, which include youngsters, have been known to kill large numbers of sheep. Jackals and hyenas do this in Africa. But generally, adult wolves are less wasteful in their hunting. They also scavenge carcasses. In regions where farming methods are traditional, many domestic animals die from natural causes. But all too often, these deaths are attributed to wolves. Vultures, which still occur in good numbers in Spain, survive by clearing up the corpses. If a stockman comes across a scene like this in a wolf area, his immediate reaction is to blame the wolf. But in almost every case, it is probably death from disease or the work of wild dogs. This farmer, who lives close to Madrid, shot a feral dog as it tried to catch one of his sheep by the throat. He estimates that in 2 years, dogs have cost him £4,000 in lost stock. Biologist Juan Carlos Blanco believes that overall, dogs probably cause many 100 times more damage. But the wolf gets the blame. In the Cantabrian mountains, whenever a corpse is discovered, game wardens come in to investigate. In this case, the wounds do look like the work of wolves, and compensation will be paid. A new pack has been active in the hills and is preying consistently on cattle. And before local farmers take the law into their own hands, the wardens organize an official hunt.
Que está muy húmeda. Está aquí este hombre con todo el macuto. Veréis arriba uno, ¿eh?
A single wolf is shot. But for the wolves of Spain as a whole, this is probably the lesser of two evils. 20 years ago, they were almost wiped out with poison. Now at least only a few problem animals are removed, and the hunting also diffuses the farmer's anger. In years gone by, villagers would have spat and thrown stones at a dead wolf. Now they gather round to see and touch this seldom seen animal. Many people find the killing of wolves abhorrent. But in general, biologists and game wardens think the wolf can survive limited local hunting.
When I am alone, I'm thinking that poor wolf, maybe we are working with a species that we don't know if will survive to human progress. But reality shows you that there's a problem, there are attacks on cattle, and you have to allow some hunting.
In the Cantabrian mountains, the situation is fairly stable. But in other regions of Spain, there is still enormous resentment. Because although there is a system of compensation, it is simply not implemented by many of the regional governments. In Galicia, where 1/4 of the damage is done, 99% is never paid for, as it happens outside reserves. And because farmers are not compensated, they hunt the wolf when they can. However, this is at least better than reverting to poison. Many of the hunts are little more than a ritual walking of the hills, with almost a carnival atmosphere. To ensure the wolf's survival in Spain, the compensation problem must be solved. Also, a means of diverting the wolf's attention from domestic stock is urgently needed. One way is to make sure that there are plenty of roe deer and other natural quarry available. Once they were heavily hunted, but now villagers are drifting away to work in the towns, the deer may recover. Wild boar are an important, if formidable, prey species too. If there are deer and boar to hunt and stock is better shepherded and guarded, then the wolf will melt back unnoticed into the landscape. In urban Spain, public opinion is more favorable towards the wolf. But outside the cities, attitudes still have to change. In fact, they must change if this unique European population of wolves is not to disappear. The European community is considering helping in this process with funds for wolf conservation. If damages were paid, it might win over the stock farmers and shepherds. It is possible for wolves to live in areas inhabited by man. The question is, will man let his ancient enemy live with him?